For example, for religious liberty, everybody knows that during the Middle Age, the Catholic Church did not live according to that principle. But to be fair to the Catholic, it changed in 1965, when they have the Second Vatican Council, because they made a declaration for religious liberty.
All right, guys, welcome back. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some things with regards to religious liberty, since this is the General Conference Seventh-day Adventist Religious Liberty Director. For the most part, he oversees a lot of things that happen within the General Conference Church, and particularly with regards to what recently happened with the situation concerning the pandemic as well. And that is why a lot of stuff that's happening right now, such as the Conrad Vine situation, is taking place because men like this are in positions that they are in and making the decisions that they are making. Ganoune Diop is the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Seventh-day Adventist General Conference Church. Ganoune Diop has not been seen since about May because of a canceled event. Ganoune Diop had a heart attack, and many people were praying for him because he was in intensive care. And I feel truly sad for this man. I believe he is deceived. I believe that he is deceiving many people. Conrad Vine has recently come out with regards to the religious liberty directives that took place during the pandemic, and he believes that should this crisis occur again, that there should be some major changes going on within the General Conference, and a lot of the leadership today is really standing up against this, and even some of the lay people who I believe are a little ignorant as to all the situation that is taking place here. But we will get into that a little bit more as we continue here. Now, there is a chapter entitled Liberty of Conscience Threatened. It's chapter 35 of the Great Controversy, and I highly recommend it, not just for everybody watching this, but especially for men like Ganoune Diop, because this says that Romanism is now regarded by Protestants with far greater favor than in former years. Furthermore, on page 563 in the same chapter, it says the time was when Protestants placed a high value upon the liberty of conscience, which had been so dearly purchased. They taught their children to abhor popery and held that to seek harmony with Rome would be disloyalty to God. But how widely different are the sentiments now expressed? What kind of sentiments are men like Ganoune Diop expressing today? Are they expressing sentiments that are going to tell their children to abhor popery, or teach their children to understand that popery is definitely not from God? Well, that is what some Seventh-day Adventists are going to teach their children. But in regards to the General Conference today, what have they come to believe? When Ganoune Diop says that at Vatican II, the Catholics changed their view in regards to religious liberty, what does this tell us about his view in regards to the Great Controversy? That it will never change its view. It's telling us that he is fulfilling the words of the Great Controversy by now expressing a widely different sentiment. Furthermore, in Great Controversy, page 564, it says the Papal Church will never relinquish her claim to infallibility. All that she has done in her persecution of those who reject her dogmas, she holds to be right. And would she not repeat the same acts should the opportunity be presented? Let the restraints now imposed by secular governments be removed and Rome be reinstated to her former power, and there would be speedily a revival of her tyranny and persecution. Remember the Great Controversy Project? Some of you might remember when Ted Wilson was pushing this issue, and then of course they replaced it with the Great Hope, and they had a Tower of Babel built where they prayed around these great controversies that they were trying to push into the world, but yet it was the Great Hope that was being pushed. This all talking about a book, The Great Hope, that removed most of the Reformation. The book, The Great Hope, basically removed the protest against the papal power and the Reformation that took place during the Dark Ages. In other words, basically they've tossed some of the anti-Catholicism to the historical trash heap. And that's what Neil Wilson, Ted Wilson's father, once said. He said, although it is true that there was a period in the life of Seventh-day Adventist Church when the denomination took a distinctly anti-Roman Catholic viewpoint, and the term hierarchy was used in a pejorative sense to refer to the papal form of church governance, that attitude on the church's part was nothing more than a manifestation of widespread anti-popery among conservative Protestant denominations in the early part of this century and the latter part of the last, and which has now been consigned to the historical trash heap so far as the Seventh-day Adventist Church is concerned. So this has been going on for years. This is not something that just happened yesterday. The General Conference leadership has had this view of the papacy for many years. They believe that the papacy's views on religious liberty have changed. And of course, they've tossed the Great Controversy really to the historical trash heap, at least the part that has to do with the anti-papacy stuff and the Reformation. The Great Hope is now being pushed, and they call it the Great Controversy Project. Back to the Great Controversy in the chapter on religious liberty, it says, "Shall this power, whose record for 1,000 years is written in the blood of the saints, be now acknowledged as part of the Church of Christ?" Well, I think it might be. You see, this is Casey Esmuck. He wrote the book, Let Mutual Love Continue. This is him standing with Ted Wilson, and you might read this book and know what it says. It tells us that 5 centuries of conflict dating back to Martin Luther, rivalry and prejudice between Catholics and Protestants are being overcome. They certainly are being overcome when you look at him standing with Ted Wilson after writing this. See, these people are working together to heal the deadly wound of the beast power being the Roman papacy. This is page 122 of Mutual Love Continue, the book that they're holding up in the picture. Furthermore, in this book, it tells us in page 33 that gathered from 24 different church families, we welcome one another. Please stand as we acknowledge your church family. African initiated, Anglican Baptist, Catholic, Seventh-day Adventist, United and Uniting Waldensian. Let mutual love continue, page 33. So these people are working together for something that has to do with reuniting Catholics with apostate Protestantism, which is all prophesied in the book, The Great Controversy. Interesting how that happens. But Ganoune Diop is the face of Seventh-day Adventist Church to the world. He represents a church at ecumenical events. He's much more than just a server. He's an active participant. He's an organizer and sometimes chairs certain events along with the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity and other Vatican officials. Diop's name is found in the book, Let Mutual Love Continue. You'll notice on page 43, the Reverend Ganoune Diop is listed as a Global Christian Forum committee member who represents the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Furthermore, on page 406, the Reverend Ganoune Diop, representing the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is listed as a member of the 3rd Global Gathering Planning Group for the Global Christian Forum. Also, on page 202, there's a picture of Ganoune Diop playing his flute at the Global Christian Forum. The World Council of Churches, which is an ecumenical movement. You'll notice here in this picture, there's Ganoune Diop, and then, of course, Cassie Esumuck, the one who wrote Let Mutual Love Continue. Remember the book? They're standing almost next to each other. They are working together. There are even statements from Ganoune Diop on the World Council of Churches website talking about how we might work together to send the message to the world.
In 1965, with the document Dignitatis Humani, for example, a beautiful text, by the way, on religious freedom. So in other words, Adventists have to be educated also in what is happening in the world so that we will not slander people, not knowing their contribution.
So now we are slandering the Catholic Church if we fail to accept what happened at Vatican II with regards to their document on religious liberty. Now, Roman Catholics are actually role models for religious liberty, and we have to turn to them to understand religious liberty. This is what we're being taught by Ganoune Diop, and that if we speak against some of their past or the way that they might be today because we don't believe they've changed, we are slandering the papacy. And basically, we need to be re-educated.
This is not complicated, but people who neglect education, start criticizing.
The uneducated are criticizing the papacy. They're criticizing the religious liberty aspects of the papacy. Certainly, we are the uneducated that he's referring to. However, if we read the Great Controversy, it talks about something different, and I believe that this should be our education as Seventh-day Adventists. It tells us on page 563 in the same chapter we've been talking about that the defenders of the papacy declare that the church has been maligned. Sounds like Ganoune Diop. Many urge that it is unjust to judge the church of today by the abominations and absurdities that marked her reign during the centuries of ignorance and darkness. Now telling us in 1965 they changed their ways. This is what Ganoune Diop is trying to teach us or trying to educate Adventists about. He's totally coming against every teaching in the Great Controversy. Furthermore, in the Great Controversy, it says the pacific tone of Rome in the United States does not imply a change of heart. She is tolerant where she is helpless, says Bishop O'Connor. Religious liberty is merely endured until the opposite can be carried into effect without peril to the Catholic world. So Ganoune Diop needs to educate himself with the Great Controversy. When I was watching this video, I saw Ganoune Diop reciting parts of the Quran. and he had it memorized in his mind, and he could recite it word for word. So what about the Bible? What about the Great Controversy? What is Ganoune Diop's thoughts on that? Why is he not promoting views that are in consistency with the Bible and with the spirit of prophecy if he's a Seventh-day Adventist? Not only that, but he's the director of religious liberty. How does this man get this position in the Seventh-day Adventist church? Well, some people would say, well, it falls on the people. They're the ones who elect their leaders. Well, then it's time to stop being quiet. It's time to wake up. And if so many people think that silence, we shouldn't broadcast anything that's going wrong inside of the General Conference Church. Do you know why evil prevails? Because when good men remain silent, evil will prevail. And that's what's happened within the General Conference. And it's time to stand up for the truth. It's time to stand up for what's right.
So in other words, Adventists have to be educated also in what is happening in the world, so that we will not slander people, not knowing their contribution.
Okay, regarding slander, we're going to read the Great Controversy here a little bit. She says on page 565, 566, she says, Romanism as a system is no more in harmony with the gospel of Christ now than in any former period in her history. The Protestant churches are in great darkness, or they would discern the signs of the times. Obviously, Ganoune Diop is not teaching present truth, nor is he pushing the real truth for this time. That was what the General Conference was actually supposed to do. It was to be used to push present truth, and especially with regards to aspects on religious liberty. But men like Ganoune Diop are turning their backs on the people of Adventism. In fact, we're told furthermore in the same chapter, men are closing their eyes to the real character of Romanism and the dangers to be apprehended from her supremacy. The people need to be aroused to resist the advances of this most dangerous foe to civil and religious liberty. You cannot be the religious liberty director of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and not know this stuff, but obviously this is exactly what is happening.
For example, for religious liberty, everybody knows that during the Middle Age, the Catholic Church did not live according to that principle. But to be fair to the Catholic, it changed in 1965, when they have the Second Vatican Council, because they made a declaration for religious liberty.
So it changed. Is that what really happened? Is Catholicism changed? Again, back to the same chapter in the book, Great Controversy, it says, the Roman Church now presents a fair front to the world, covering with apologies her horrible cruelties. She has clothed herself in Christ-like garments, but she is unchanged. Every principle of the papacy that existed in past ages exists today. Let none deceive themselves. Ganoune Diop. The papacy that Protestants are now so ready to honor is the same that ruled the world in the days of the Reformation. Furthermore, on page 580, it says, and let it be remembered, it is the boast of Rome that she never changes. The principles of Gregory VII and Innocent III are still the principles of the Roman Catholic Church. And had she but the power, she would put them in practice with as much vigor as in past centuries. This is all in a chapter entitled Religious Liberty Threatened. And this is the man, Ganoune Diop, who's supposed to be the religious liberty director. You know what? Honestly, this is what Great Controversy 571 says. It's so clear. It says there has been a change, but the change is not in the papacy. Catholicism indeed resembles much of the Protestantism that now exists, because Protestantism has so greatly degenerated since the days of the Reformers. Let me give you some examples of how Protestantism and apostate Protestantism, especially the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, has changed in regards to religious liberty, because the leopard, like beast, cannot change her spots. It should never be forgotten what happened during the pandemic.
But Adventists individually have freedom of conscience. And this is true for so many things. For example, we have been at the General Conference accused recently for promoting, and we have not promoted that.
Well, I think that's a little different. I'm not going to go into that, but I can show you statement after statement of what they promoted, what their ideas were promoting, and how they were promoting the inoculations during that time. And even when the Supreme Court was upholding the mandates of Joe Biden, and they were about to push it on all the institutions and workers across America, where people were not going to be able to hold their jobs anymore, the General Conference did not provide exemptions, religious exemptions to the people. But furthermore, not only did the General Conference not provide religious exemptions, but they were ready to support the mandates and even have their own people forced to be inoculated or else lose their jobs. This is what the General Conference was doing. They were pushing this in many places. And not only that, but even when Florida opposed the mandate of Biden, Advent Health was still supporting it over Florida's government. So they were pushing it on the people. So Ganoune Diop is not telling the truth. Some people were forced to take these things. Some people lost their livelihoods. Some people lost their lives. Some people were injured during this time. And the General Conference did not stand with any of them.
Adventists have freedom of conscience to refuse to be. However, that doesn't mean that the church has to stand for the person.
Wow. Imagine taking a stand, losing your children, and no one standing with you. This is where the church is right now. And they would leave you, not only with regards to the mandates that took place during the pandemic, but furthermore, there is mandates also that are coming. And should this crisis occur again, well, Conrad Vine said what we should do. And there's a few people that appreciate what Conrad Vine is saying.
The third point there is more contentious. I put there, if the GC supports future mandates over the consciences of members. That's an important caveat. If the GC in the future supports future mandates over the consciences of mandates, I think we are well within our rights to establish a parachurch movement within the Adventist Church. What is that? A parachurch movement would be a gathering, a lay conference of laity. They gather, they maybe incorporate, they return their tithes to that new lay entity that covers the whole of North American division, and then the committee allocates that tithe to conferences who are faithful to Scripture. And that way, the conferences that go woke will go broke. Very simple. And the members will determine where that tithe goes based on fidelity to Scripture and whether they are willing to contend for the faith that has been passed on to us. Well, I recognize this is, when you touch the question of tithe, this is the sacred nerve in the Adventist Church. But Elder Wilson did say in his first sermon, hold your leaders to account. So we're going to hold our leaders to account.
Let's just take a look again at Ganoune Diop. And of course, many of these leaders need to be accounted for. They need to turn from their ways.
The Seventh-day Adventist Church, the Department of Health and the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department have supported and made it clear that the health crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic is a public health issue, not one of religious liberty.
This is a matter of the blind leading the blind. And that's what's happening. Some of the blind still are following their leaders. Had Nebuchadnezzar made a decree saying that, hey, this is not a religious liberty issue, guys. This doesn't it doesn't matter what your consciences say with regards to what you put in your bodies. Well, these men would have stood and died for their faith. And that's exactly what some of us are willing to do in these cases where these things are forced upon us. We will not touch these things. It doesn't matter if the government tries to force it into us, but we should have our church standing behind us, and it's not.
Church has chosen not to issue exemption letters based on the prudence of not impinging upon the realm of state authority.
So why did the General Conference not give religious exemptions? They didn't want to step on the toes of the state authority. You see, during the time of the Dark Ages, there were many who didn't have churches that stood behind them, and they lost much because the churches didn't want to step on the toes of the state authority in regards to issues like the Sabbath, for instance. Now, what about if the state mandates Sunday laws and forces your church to close? What if the state does this? Do we not want to impinge upon the state's authority?
Corporate responsibility in the form of an official church position, such as, for example, the absolute right to observe the Sabbath, not to work on the Sabbath, not to take exams or to go to school on the Sabbath, is supported by international law. and can benefit from accommodations and exemptions.
So we can give exemptions for people as long as it goes along with what the state says. But if the state says no, then we can't give exemptions. That's what he just said. When international law does not support your right to keep the Sabbath, then they won't be able to give you religious exemptions. See, this is what the General Conference is for. But yet they are not standing behind their people, no matter, even if it comes down to Sabbath laws and Sunday laws.
Church has chosen not to issue exemption letters based on the prudence of not impinging upon the realm of state authority.
It all comes down to whether the state says yes or no. This is our religious liberty director, and some of the church leaders, for the most part, are saying this is God's government, this is God's church, this is God's authority, this is God's voice speaking, the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And what is this voice saying?
For example, for religious liberty, everybody knows that during the Middle Age, the Catholic Church did not live according to that principle. But to be fair to the Catholic, it changed in 1965, when they have the Second Vatican Council, because they made a declaration for religious liberty, So this is why we cannot slander Catholics just to say, oh no, they are not, they are against. Yeah, historically, because of, the Inquisition and so forth, was terrible, and the Catholics were not a model, but that changed.
The Catholics were not a model, but that changed. Now the Catholics are a model, a role model for religious liberty. This is what he's telling us. This is our leadership. The blind leading the blind. Are these still the leaders of the remnant of our seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ? You know what else Conrad Vine said? He said this.
The church, when we talk about the church, we often mean the legal hierarchy, like the North New England Conference, the Atlantic Union, North American Division, the General Conference. When we talk about the church as members, that's often what we mean. But the truth of the matter is, if the government of Maine were to cancel the registration, the legal registration of the Northern New England Conference, does that mean the Adventist Church would cease to exist in Maine, yes or no?
That should be a wake-up call right there. What he just said is that we think that the corporate structure of the General Conference and all the other conferences is actually what constitutes God's church. The reality is that is not the church. There is a new organization built on sand, and as many are obviously discovering, there's a call to set yourselves free from that. There's a call to come out of her, my people. That is not God's church. That is a counterfeit of God's church, and I'm going to share with you more as we continue. But in regards to this, God has a church. It's not the great cathedral. It's not the national establishment. It's not the denominations. It is the people who love God and keep his commandments. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Matthew 18:20, where Christ is even among the humble few. This is Christ's church. For the presence of the high and holy one who inhabiteth eternity can alone constitute a church. That is the Spirit of God. The presence of God alone constitutes his church. The General Conference, the Spirit is not there. Christ is standing on the outside. He's knocking. He wants to come in, but he's not inside. And the church is the fullness of him that filleth all in all. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 22 and 23. It is Christ, born again believers, born of the mother of us all, the remnant of her seed, who keep the commandments of God. Not the church that is killing babies in their institutions, that is forcing government mandates on the people and making sure they take these things that are contrary to the health message. That's not even keeping God's commandments. That's completely contrary to God's commandment-keeping church. And it is a counterfeit. It professes to be his commandment-keeping church, but the reality is it is not. And anybody with eyes to see can see. If you can't see that these people are leading you back to Rome, that these leaders are pushing Roman Catholic principles and papal principles that are completely contrary to the Great Controversy is pointing you in a direction that is contrary to everything that this leadership is pointing you towards. And for the most part, the Great Controversy says that many of the laity will not rise higher than their leadership. And this leadership, continuing on, as in the days of Elijah, as in the days of Martin Luther, until good men did something, evil prevailed. There could be no reformation until good men would say something and do something. And until they say that is not the church, there can be no true reformation. And that's what happened during the Dark Ages. At one point, they had to admit, hey, this is not God's church. There's something wrong here. There is some Catholic leadership going on, and they espouse the same views with respect to religious liberty that the Catholic Church had espoused. And there was a call when they wanted to unite with the state, when they wanted to use the state and push the state mandates, there was a call to come out of her, my people. It's the Spirit of the Lord is with them. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. The Spirit of the Lord can alone constitute his church. And where is the liberty? Where is the liberty of conscience? They are espousing the same principles. And should this crisis occur again, well, what should we do? 3 Testimonies, page 553, said it would be poor policy to support from the treasury of God those who really mar and injure his work, and who are constantly lowering the standard of Christianity. Who's lowering the standard of Christianity, guys? Take a good look at the General Conference leadership right now. Take a good look at Ganoune Diop, Ted Wilson, Mark Finley, and even the ministers that are in it, such as Stephen Bohr and Ivor Myers. Many of these leaders are turning their backs on their congregations. And guess what you're going to be called when you stand up? You're going to be called a troubler of Israel, just like Elijah was. You're going to be called a rebel, just like Elijah and Martin Luther and all these others were. The counsel of God tells us what God's church is, and how many are actually referring to the church for what the Spirit of prophecy says the church is. Not many. And that's why there's so much confusion as to what God's organization is, which is something that we need to look at and talk about a lot more right now. Anyways, God bless. I'll see you guys in the next video.